So The Offing, I wrote it as a novel. It was a holiday for my mind, basically. It was, I wrote it over 3 years while working on other projects. And it's set in, I'll describe it for people who don't know. It's set in and around Robin Hood's Bay on the North Yorkshire coast, which is a former smuggling village. And it's set in the summer of 1946, so just after the Second World War. And it concerns a young man from the Durham coalfields. I'm from Durham City, and he's 16 years old, and he sets out on this basically just for a wander, and what will possibly be his final summer of freedom before he has to go down the pit and become a miner like his father and his father's father. And along the way, he encounters an older woman called Dulcie, who lives in a cottage overlooking the sea. And they hit it off. They're two very different people. Dulcie is mature and worldly and bohemian and a little bit vulgar. And she's a powerful, charismatic presence. But as it transpires, as the novel evolves, we discover that she's in mourning for a loss that she's experienced. And over the course of this summer, Robert and Dulcie kind of bring something out of one another. She helps Robert become cultured and cultivates an interest in poetry and food and swimming and literature and the whole concept of freedom at a time when England is still recovering from the Second World War. And in turn, Robert kind of helps Dulcie come out of this period of grieving. The plot, I don't mind admitting that the plot to The Offing is quite simple and quite uncomplicated, and some might say thin, but that's actually quite deliberate. After writing some quite plot-heavy novels, I wanted this book to be about the summer and a celebration of the English countryside, and food and all the things that I like, which includes swimming in the sea, or wild swimming as some people call it. And as I said, it was written at a time when I felt I needed to, because I love writing and I write most days and I'm obsessed by writing books. But I knew I couldn't write anything too dark or too oppressive, mentally oppressive. My own books were, to even read my own books was causing me a lot of anxiety, which isn't a very good selling point for anyone who's interested in discovering my back catalogue, but that's the truth of it. And all the locations in The Offing are real. So it's pretty much 100% places that I've been to, right down to a little shack in a meadow, which is at the center of the simple plot. That exists as well. And I've stayed there several times, which gave me the idea to write the book. And it came out last summer in hardback, and it came out in March this year in paperback. And it was signed by Bloomsbury after I'd been publishing works with a smaller independent publisher before that. And it's just become a bestseller in Germany, I've just been told. It's number 11 in the charts there. Because their shops have been open during the lockdown. In Germany, books are considered essential items. So it's been quite good for me. I've not strayed far from my house for 10 weeks, but during that time, I've become known in Germany, which is very weird. It's an abstract concept to me because my German publisher has really been pushing the book out there, and it's kind of taken off online, and it's become a bit of an Instagram thing where lots of people are publishing photographs of the book by the sea. And it's just sort of snowballed. It's something I haven't even been a part of, because normally when you put a book out, like The Offing in the UK last summer, you are thrown into a world of publicity and interviews and appearances and signings and stuff. And some of it's good and some of it's excruciating and just hard to do. It's hard to kind of represent yourself and your book publicly. But in Germany, I haven't had to do that, and I haven't been able to do that. And it's just been optioned for film and television here as well. And so it's all evolving quite nicely. There's the pitch. That's the sales pitch over with. I'm gonna have a sip of tea now.
Well, that's pretty exciting. I suppose I was going to ask you, just first of all, I mean, just to talk a little bit about the language. I mean, you said it's a simple plot, but the language is just so flamboyant and amazing. I had to look up. There was one word I in a really a glissando of birdsong I thought was just marvelous. And when I looked it up, it was like the sort of up and down the keyboard of a piano, like Little Richard. And it's just like
Little Richard, yeah.
It just is like this. The language is anything but simple, and I wondered, like, if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't mean to. Sorry, something keeps popping up on my screen. Get rid of that. I don't mean to kind of undersell the book or myself in saying it's simple, because it's the. My dog's just appeared beside me as well.
We can say hi to your dog.
Hang on. Let me grab the dog. Hang on. There's Cliff.
Hello, Cliff.
Cliff's quite well known because I wrote a non-fiction book called Under the Rock, which is about the local landscape and mythology, and he features in it a lot. So whenever I'm out walking, he gets recognised quite a bit, and no one knows who I am. But to answer your question, I mean, the book is quite simple, but it's actually the novel that I've spent the longest time writing. I spent 3 years on it, not every day, but a lot of the time was spent getting the language and the vocabulary right. And I read a lot of poetry, and I write poems in between novels, I guess. I don't consider myself a poet at all, but I enjoy absorbing language. And really the offing is something that I would say the first 30 pages I probably wrote 15 times. So I spent about a year and a half just writing the opening chapter. Every week I would go to the library in Halifax, which is the nearest big town to me. And a lot of this was written during miserable winter days, snow falling outside maybe. So and I would go to the library and sit in a little booth and mentally escape to a meadow in summer in North Yorkshire. And part of that was, part of the attempt to bring it to life was a real concentration on the language that I used. So I just knew that I had to get the opening section right, and that would determine the tone and the plot and the whole development of the book. So each week I would go with my little printout and work with pen and paper in the library just on the first chapter. And I realized that when you're writing about things like landscape and summer and meadows and the coast and the sea, it's very easy to rely on the same words every time, and you realize that you're repeating the same words, and it's boring, and it's it's lazy writing, really. I mean, I think that the sea is one of the sort of great used metaphors in literature, because it represents so much. But in writing about the sea, you find yourself repeating what other people have said. So even just describing the color of the sea in an original way is quite hard. So I set myself the challenge of trying to expand my own vocabulary to determine the vocabulary of the novel. And it's also a novel about poetry. Without giving away the plot, there's a manuscript which was once lost, is found and brought back to life, and it's a manuscript of poems. And Dulcie and Robert, the two main characters, discuss poetry a lot, particularly people like John Clare, who's one of the great English rural poets. So I thought if I was going to talk about poetry, I had to make the language poetic as well.
And you mentioned how you've stayed in the cottage and you know the area so well, and I think that is through the language. It's one of the things that comes across, is that because it is only the one summer, you feel that as you're reading it, you're experiencing it, because it's such a sort of full body onslaught of all your senses, from the food to the smells, the taste, the sounds, everything is happening. And I just wondered, I mean, it's almost like you had a sort of dictaphone as you were doing it, like sort of like transcribing it. And I have to ask you about the grass baths. I've been like fascinated by the idea of the grass baths, and that's not a particular spoiler, but yeah, can you talk about the experience of it? And
Well, as I said, I've stayed in a lot of the locations, and before I was writing the offing, or what became the offing, I had nights out staying in the meadow that's in the book, sitting on a bench and watching the light fall, and just sort of mentally taking notes, or probably literally taking notes actually. I think if you're going to write about the countryside and the sort of the fine detail of something like, say, a sunset in summer at this time of year, you have to, it helps if you can to be immersive, to be there as it happens, and remember the feelings and the sensations and the way the light falls and the things you can hear as well. So a lot of it comes from its actual research of sitting there. And just before I came and did this interview, I've been out in the back garden with my wife, and there's beautiful light out there, and we've got a plant which is just buzzing with bees, which are feeding at the moment, and then you've got birds and crows coming in to the feeders. But it's only if you actually stop. I mean, stop me if I'm stating the obvious here, but it's only if you actually stop and take a moment to just think, right, what can I hear? What can I see? What can I smell? And if you write that down in as imaginative a way as possible, then it'll really help bring a place like the meadow in the book to life. You mentioned grass baths, which is, for those who haven't read the book, it's something that Robert does, which is, he is a bit of a nature boy, but because he comes from a pit village, his experience of nature has been quite limited, and it's a sort of industrial landscape. When he arrives in Robin Hood's Bay, it's beautiful rolling agricultural lands, fields, and little wooded vales running down to the sea. So it's very beautiful, and it really is like that. So he immerses himself as I do, probably, as a writer. And one of the things he does that I don't do is that he bathes in. He has these grass baths, which is basically he takes his clothes off and rolls around in the wet grass, the dew in the morning, to clean himself. I don't even know where that came from. I suspect I maybe read about someone doing that. I mean, I prefer actual baths to grass baths. And it was 1946, and it's not 1946 now, so we've got the advantage of modern conveniences. But yeah, I think that was just one of the. I used that as a way to show him literally connecting with the landscape. Another way is that part of the reason he ends up in Robin Hood's Bay is because he wants to swim in the sea, which is something he hasn't really done. And that in itself is an experience, and something I do quite a lot. And again, while writing the book, I would go in the North Sea. I mean, I don't live anywhere near the sea. I'm 100 miles away. I'm inland, but I would go over there on trips for a few days, and just to be in the sea in England in the summertime. If you swim out of your depth, it's an experience. And I think some of the book was written mentally while floating about, letting the tide take me, and just the little details. If you taste the sea, obviously we know it's vile, but it's a very specific taste, and it's quite hard to describe unless you do it and sort of remember how horrible it is. And you can taste a bit of sand, and it's a little bit fishy and gritty and a bit oily. So that is another way, I guess, of showing this narrator's kind of, he's fallen in love with the landscape, really, and he's fallen in love with life as that happens. And because he's 16, I always think that that's really a crucial age, I think, for anyone, because it's when you've just left school and you're not quite old enough to have total freedom, but you know it's there. You know it's just beyond the horizon. You know adulthood and the rest of the world is waiting for you, and you're just itching to kind of, excuse me, to get out there and experience life. And that's what the book is about, and that's what Robert is. I should add that the novel is being told in retrospect by Robert as an old man. So it's him looking back on the summer that changed his life, and that was the summer he met Dulcie.
It'd be nice to talk a little bit about their friendship and the way, like you said, I mean, it's, I sort of imagined it like a sort of anvil point where he sort of opened himself up to whatever happened, whichever way he might fall, with whatever influences that that he meets along his way. And Dulcie, I mean, I love all novels that have like friendships that are sort of like cross-generational, and you know, it's such an important thing that happens in his life. And it just struck me, I don't know, I'm waffling now. Earlier in the year, I went to the Museum of African American History in another lifetime before lockdown and COVID, and there was a banner that was on display that was, I think it said "Lift as we climb," and it was something that was obviously very pertinent to race relations and things like that at the time. But I remember the quote that Dulcie said is, I think he says something to her like, why are you being so nice to me? And she says, it's what I do, and maybe one day you will too. And it's that sort of like baton being passed by age. And it feels so particularly pertinent, I suppose, at the moment where we have like all young people who are all a little bit floundering, you know, in this situation. And then there's this character who is helping. And I thought it'd be nice for you to talk a little bit about that, perhaps.
Yeah, the answer to, well, it's twofold really. The Gallows Pole is a very masculine novel. As I said, it was a historical novel based in fact about a gang of forgers in the 18th century in Yorkshire, and it was very heavily researched, but history and research only gave me male characters. So it was a criminal gang, which isn't to say that female, real life women weren't involved in this endeavor, but they've been written out of history. So the Gallows Pole ended up being a very male orientated, masculine novel, because that's what the research told me. and I was really pleased with the reception of the book, but the one recurring criticism is that there was barely any female characters in it, to which I replied, well, if I want to stay true to the story, I can't put many female characters in. It'd be like writing about the England male football team and putting some female players in there. It's just not true to the fact of the events. So I decided with the offing, whatever the story was going to be, and I wasn't quite sure, I just knew it was going to be about a stronger, solitary woman of maturing years who has charisma and influence. I just wanted to write. Well, the other thing, part of the reason for that was because I've read a lot of interviews with female actors who have spoken about a lack of roles as they get older. Once they get into their 40s and 50s, basically, there's not much work for them. They've said, obviously there's exceptions, you know, Meryl Streep or Judi Dench or whoever, and the strong female leads who'll always get work. But I was aware that it is true that men get more widely cast, irregardless of how old they are or how they look, whereas women are judged a lot more strongly and unfairly. So I wanted to, in my mind, create a character who would be a strong on-screen presence, even if it never gets made. When I mean on-screen presence, I mean in the book as well. So I thought, I'm going to write a lead character that is hopefully so likable and engaging that she is brought into being, maybe on screen at some point. But the other aspect of that is that, I mean, I've been a writer for a sort of like, or trying to be a writer for my adult life, really. And I've had loads of failed novels and loads of unpublished, half-finished works, and probably, let me think, at least 15 years have been completely broke. And I work as a freelance journalist as well. So I get by on what I can eke from journalism. But one of the reasons I've been able to publish more books recently is through the support and help of other people, like benevolent patrons, I suppose, or just the odd person in literature who has been able to, or organisation who've given me a grant to help me live for 3 or 4 months while I write a book, or an organisation who own a property in Scotland and have let me go and stay there to go and write in a remote cottage in Scotland. So I wanted to kind of show that I think it's your duty as a person, if you're in a position to be able to help people, particularly in the arts, where I'm, as far as I'm concerned, music and literature and visual art, I think it's your duty to be able to, as you say, pass that baton on. So Dulcie represents several people who've helped me out, even in just a very small way. To them has ended up being a large and significant way to me, that has meant the difference between giving up writing and, getting, God forbid, an actual proper job and continuing with writing books. So yeah, Dulcie represents, well, the other thing as well is that pretty much everyone who I sort of work with closely as a writer is female. My agent, my editor, publicist, and all of that. And that's like a deliberate choice on my part where possible, because men are just a pain in the arse, and working with men just becomes like, there's an underlying sense of competitiveness and masculinity that I don't like. Women are far easier to work with. Men are just less developed people, and therefore Dulcie represents all the strong, interesting women who've raised me, or who I work with, or I'm married to. She's the personification of various people of various ages, from various backgrounds, from various walks of life. But I kind of poured that gratitude into her, really.
Oh, wow. I mean, I don't know what to say. That's rather wonderful. And she is like an extraordinarily wonderful character. So, anybody who hasn't read the book is going to be delighted with the new friendship that they will make with Dulcie. So that's just... I
hope so, yeah.
So I wanted to talk as well just a little bit about when you wrote it, because you said it was some time ago. I think, did you say it's 2015 when you first started?
I started writing it in 2015, and it was signed as a book in 2018. So it was 3 years of writing different edits and different versions. Yeah.
Because it feels so timely now, and you said it was like a holiday almost for yourself to go into the book whilst you were writing it, and I think that's why people who have read it feel it's such an amazingly wonderful gift to read at the moment, when we're sort of looking, we are slowing down, not necessarily out of choice, but we're being forced to slow down, and the sort of reconnecting with nature and all of these things are people are finding themselves doing at the moment. But I thought it was interesting because that was sort of quite a Brexity vote time, and in the first, I'm going to just find it, there was a bit that I was quite struck by, just with the way you described the sea, and how you said it was like reminded Robert of the finite existence of solid matter, and that the only true boundaries are not trenches and shelters and checkpoints, but those between rock, sea and sky. And I think I once at a publisher thingamy met Tim Peake, and it was at about that time, and he said, there are no boundaries in space. You look down and it's just geography, like mountain ranges and things. And I thought maybe, I don't know, you might want to talk a little bit about that with the war compared to now, like the time it's
no, I mean, you've nailed it, as has Tim Peake, really, because that's how I see things. I started in 2015, and the EU referendum happened in the fairly early stages of writing the book. And whichever way people fell in that vote, I think most people would agree that the atmosphere in the country was soured, and most people adopted a political position and then stuck to it and pursued that position more vehemently as things got nastier. So the general atmosphere in Britain at the time, and now, but it's kind of been forgotten about temporarily, was really divisive and ugly and petty, really. And it was very inward looking as well. I've always thought of myself as like many things. I'm from the northeast of England, but I'm English, but England is part of Britain, and Britain was part of Europe, and Europe's part of the world. So, I don't define myself as this or that, because I just think it's reductive to do that. And similarly, as I mentioned in the book, Britain and Germany was all one landmass at one point. And this is Dulcie's message to Robert. I've looked into the geography and the history of it all, and it was called Doggerland. I mean, people might know this, but out across off the coast of the North Sea is something called Doggerland, which is an area of the sea, but once it used to be land. So once you could walk from Britain to Germany. And once you think in those terms, you think, well, it's ridiculous that they're over there, we're over here, and we have to be enemies, or we have to be disdainful of one another. Same with France. You could walk to France, you could walk to Ireland. So maybe when I was writing the book, I was thinking long term. I was thinking of human life and evolution in terms of hundreds of thousands of years have led to this point that we're at today, squabbling over whether we should or shouldn't be in Europe. And part of me just does not give a single shit about that at all after a while, because the tide will keep rising and Britain will get smaller, and then a new island will be formed, and new countries will disappear and islands will appear. It's an ever-changing entity. So I'm as guilty as anyone for falling into political arguments and discussions, although I try not to do it too much. But I think we're being very short-sighted, and I don't like nationalism either, because I just don't see what good comes of it. And that's another of Dulcie's underlying messages to Robert, which is why I said it just after the Second World War, because there was a lot of, obviously, and rightly in some cases, a lot of anti-German sentiment. But Dulcie points out that a lot of people in Germany were roped into the army over there to fight the battle for a few people at the top. So I'm not a Nazi sympathizer, but I am a sympathizer to people who were sucked into conflicts. And that happened in the Second World War. And it's not a book about the war at all, but it is about the aftermath of conflict. And it could be any conflict. And it's about the divisions between countries and nations. I think when I started writing the book, I had no idea how things would transpire with regards to the UK and the EU and all the arguments and discussions. And so the timing has been quite fortuitous, actually. But it was influenced by the tone of the conversations that were happening in Britain 3 years ago.
Oh, thank you, Ben. I've seen a couple of people have popped some questions, so I'm going to just, if I call you out, unmute yourself and ask your question. So first of all, I'm going to ask Anna Jones. Would you like to ask Ben your question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to thank you for the offering, because as you've already pointed out, it was just such a fantastic timing with lockdown, and it felt like an opportunity to both read about spring and the countryside, and then to go outside and really observe it. And so it just felt like the perfect book for this time. But my question is actually about your own journey with your writing and how you built your confidence and self-esteem to go for it and stop being self-conscious about your writing, if you ever. Maybe you weren't.
It's quite a hard question, because I think writing is probably the only thing in life that I feel vaguely confident in doing. I feel I'm better at expressing myself through writing than verbally. I don't know whether it's coming across tonight or not, but I get asked to do, events where you have to sit on a stage in front of an audience, and I feel if I didn't have to do any of that, I would be happy, because the book is where I'm most confident, and on the page, really. I think at some point you just have to stop being self-conscious when it comes to writing. And there's a barrier between you as the writer and the reader. Like, a lot of what takes place is just away from it. The book ends, I finish writing it, and then there's often a gap before it comes out, and then it goes out into the world, and it's no longer I have no control over it. So at some point, probably about 10 years ago, I had to accept that a book sort of has three lives really: the writing, and then the kind of weird limbo time before it comes out, which is quite daunting, and then it's got this whole other life that begins when it comes out. And it's always interesting to talk to people, and people often sort of point out things in my books which had never occurred to me at all. And I've read reviews and essays of previous novels, and one book I wrote called Pig Iron, which came out in 2012, someone wrote an amazing essay about how it was Oedipus complex, and I read this essay, I thought, of course it is, why didn't I see that? And but I think you have to let that self-consciousness go, because otherwise you'll start analyzing everything you're writing. And I'm not sure whether any writer is happy with anything they write. I know that anything I put out can be better. I know the offing could be better. I know I could go back and I could rewrite every sentence, really, but that's just madness. Like, it's literally the path to madness if you think along those lines. So it's quite liberating to just let the book go. But as for confidence, I don't have much confidence elsewhere. But writing is maybe the only place that I feel. It's one of the few things I can do in life where I don't feel anxious about doing it, because I'm just off in another world. It's therapeutic, really. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Right, Kim Silver, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I'm halfway through the offing. I'm really enjoying it, and one of the things I'm very much enjoying is these descriptions of the natural world, and they're fantastically detailed and very they envelop Robert and they envelop the reader. I have the sense, but I'm wondering whether I'm right, that this is intensified by setting it in 1946, when much of the land has just been allowed to, it's just been allowed to grow, and also the intervening 75 years of intensive agriculture and so on haven't happened. And was that deliberate, or is this just transferring that immediacy you're talking about to the novel?
Yeah, I think I set it after the war as a way of having this sort of dialogue about just what I mentioned about sort of two people or lots of people finding the things that we have in common rather than the things that divide us. And it seemed like a perfect time to discuss that. But 1946, I mean, or those sort of post-war years. But as I was writing the novel, I realized that I didn't know too much about that period, really, not about the day-to-day, everyday, the day-to-day sort of existence of people. Because the way I saw it, history says that the war took place from 1939 to 1945. Britain was victorious, ruled Britannia, everything's brilliant, we won. When in fact rationing went on for many years, didn't it? And the late 40s were a very fallow period economically. It was actually that was the start of the decline of the mining industry, of which Durham was the heartland. So I do know about that side of things. And as I got deeper into the research, I looked into food and rationing, and I realized that all has an impact on agriculture. And but most of my novels start with the landscape anyway. The place is usually the first character before any real human characters. But yeah, it was a case of sort of wandering through the landscape and thinking, well, what would you see in 1946? You would see a lot of abandoned farms because the male population was so depleted, either through death, injury, or psychological problems. So there was a lot of work for peace workers and land workers, and Robert, obviously, as you've seen, works jobbing on farms. So yeah, it was just a combination of things really, and I wasn't entirely sure initially as to when I wanted to set it, but 1946 seemed the right time for a young man. Robert's 16, so he's known war for most of his life, and he's still sort of fully he's just young enough not to have served in the war, but he's old enough to have seen the damage caused by it, which is a very long-winded answer.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Emma Henry.
Hello.
Hi, Emma.
Hiya. I just wanted to firstly just reiterate what I think Anna said about what a perfect book for lockdown. I've read it over the last 2 days. Having felt really stressed with kids and work and everything, I just lay in my garden and just devoured it.
Great, thanks.
And we got our rubber dinghy out to use it as a paddling pool. It was covered in salt from the sea, and I have to confess I had a little taste because I was feeling so desperate to be near the sea. And I thought it tasted delicious, so I would disagree. It wasn't horrible. It was but one of the things that I really loved about the book was all the food in it, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and where that came from. Obviously it was just after rationing, and so there was this kind of there was a sudden abundance for Robert and the exotic food, and just it would just be interesting to know a bit more about where that came from with you. And there was the lobster, that bit with the wild garlic butter that I just thought was incredible, and I was salivating, and I was desperate to be near the sea eating that lobster right in that second. So it would be great to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm missing the sea as well because I live in the Pennines. It's about as far from the sea as you can get in the north of England, actually. Maybe I should read the book and
lick a dinghy. I'd recommend it.
Yeah. The food thing, I think in this country we're still very conscious of class, and it's still an ongoing conversation about who belongs to what class and how you identify as working class, middle class, and so forth. And food, I've kind of used food in the book as a way of showing the differences in class between Dulcie, who is upper middle class, and Robert, who is working class. And as the author or the creator of those characters, I'm sort of like very lower middle class, so somewhere in between the two of them. But Dulcie uses food as a way of kind of helping, I don't want to say lift Robert up because that's patronizing, and the idea of lifting up the working class is is not something I agree with, because that implies that working class people aren't happy with their life as it is. But she does, at a time when rationing is happening and there's a shortage of foods, she does open up the world to Robert through food. And the first thing that they share is some nettle tea, which they drink together, as you know, which is something that I used to drink quite a bit of when I moved back to Yorkshire from London, until I overdid it and overdosed on nettle tea and had some very dire side effects. But the main meal, the one you mentioned, of course, is where they eat some lobster. And I think lobster is a food that is seen as very upper middle class or aristocratic upper class, when in fact it's not really, because my wife's mother lived by the sea on the east coast, not too far from where the novel's set, and she could get lobster fresh off the boat from a fisherman contact for a few pounds, which struck me as quite interesting, because if I could never afford to eat lobster, it was certainly when I lived in London, it'd be £30, £40 or something. And that made me think about the indigenous foods of England and why on earth is it so expensive. And so the food aspect of the novel is this kind of signifier of class, and Robert, the two classes merging over this bonding experience of eating together. But on a more kind of prosaic level, I just like eating food, I think. And I don't drink, I don't have too many vices, but I do quite like food and I like cooking. And it's a communal thing, isn't it? It can be a way of expressing feelings or sharing feelings, or just brings people together, I think, a good meal. And I thought, what better way than a meal to bring these two very, very different characters together? Food.
Thank you. Sarah and James, I think, James, you have a question.
Yes, hello. I finished the book today. It was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed it. I was really struck by the way that the idea of like modernism, the modern, especially in poetry, of course, but also all these references to other sort of literary and cultural characters take place in the novel. What it means within that setting, especially maybe the way it comes up against the wonderful pastoral nature writing that's involved. It's almost like it was almost a character in itself, represented, of course, by Dulcie.
Yeah. So are you asking about the literary references in there?
Yes. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is just sort of pure indulgence on my part, really, because at the time that in the lead up to writing the novel, I kind of, I read a lot of nature writing, and I do kind of do it. And reviews in the past have called me a nature writer, but I don't consider myself that at all, because I know so little about species of birds or trees and things like that. But I was reading a lot of pastoral novels. And again, it's not something, I don't mind admitting that I was reading sort of like D.H. Lawrence, and he gets mentioned in the book directly by Dulcie, particularly because, and he's a great modernist writer, but specifically mentioned him because she had access to his books at a time when, Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned and it went to trial famously in 1960. So for someone to have a copy of that in 1946 was a certain type of person with certain connections. So that's the simple reason why he's mentioned in there. I was also listening to a lot of Noel Coward records, which is why he gets mentioned. And it's slightly a strange sort of, I'm very faddish and obsessive. And for years I worked as a journalist for writing about heavy metal bands and punk bands. and indie bands for Melody Maker and NME and Kerrang and magazines like that. So to suddenly get into Noel Coward was like, I was surprised. It took me by surprise that there's all this great music that's very witty and funny and literary, and really caustic and bitchy Noel Coward songs, and very English and very of the time of the novel. And he had a song called "Don't Let's Be Beastly to the Germans," which seemed a perfect sort of mantra for the book, I guess. You know, that if it had a subheading, that could be it. So yeah, I just poured all of that into the book, my own interests at the time. It wasn't a concerted effort to try and represent modernism or anything like that, but it sort of certainly reflected my tastes while writing the book.
Thank you, Ben. I think we've probably just got time really to finish off by asking what you're reading now. What would you recommend? Because given that so many people are just about to read the offing, they might want to read something recommended by you afterwards, or if they've just finished, it would be quite interesting to hear what you're currently reading.
And I've just started reading Sarah Moss, who wrote Ghost Wall. Do you know that novel?
She came to my shop with I think that novel is amazing. Yeah.
Well, I loved it. I've been sent her next novel, which is called Summer Water, I believe. It's not out till August, and I got sent an advance copy of that, which I'm really enjoying. I'll have to look at my shelves and see what I've got. I've just read a novel. I'm reading. Oh God. This is why I keep lists. I keep lists for whenever anyone asks what I'm reading, because I'm always caught off guard. I read a book by Julian McLaren Ross, which is another 1940s set book. I've just read a lot of William Golding novels, because I've been writing about William Golding. I'd never read Lord of the Flies until last year, age 43, which people seem quite shocked by, but I was never taught it at school, and for some reason I never read it. So, but yeah, I've been writing forward for William Golding, a reissue of another novel of his. So I've been immersed fully in his entire output. I'm writing an historic. I'm writing. I can't even explain what I'm writing. I'm writing a novel that's expansive, and it's set over 1,300 years, about the northeast of England. So I'm doing a lot of quite dry reading for that, which is historic research, which I've been dipping into on and off for a couple of years. I recommend a writer called Rob Doyle, who has just written a very good book called Threshold. He's an Irish writer. It reads like non-fiction travel essays. There's a lot of drug taking in it, and a lot of very bizarre situations that the author finds himself in. But it might be fiction, it might be fact, it's hard to tell. That's really good. Most of my favourite writers at the moment are coming out of Ireland. So Kevin Barry, there's a really good writer called Wendy Erskine, who's done a debut short story collection called Sweet Home. I really want to read Sebastian Barry's new novel, which I haven't read yet. I've just bought Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy, which I've never read. I've been reading lots of E.M. Forster. Yeah, that's it for now. There's a lot more there's about 60 books by my bed, but some of them have been there for years and are never going to get read. But I should have done the interview through there, and I could tell you.
Well, my part by my bed is now a bookcase, so
Okay.
It's grown a lot. And lastly, very, very lastly, I saw you posted something on Twitter. Is this something that you've just finished? Not something you're working on? Have you just finished something? Or
I was at the post today.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my next book, which is called Male Tears, and it's a short story collection. It's coming out on Bloomsbury next year, early next year. I don't know the date. And it's a collection of short stories about useless, inept, arrogant, doomed men, many of whom get maimed in quite violent agricultural disasters. There's a combine harvester involved. They're not all like, I sound really anti-male here. Some of the stories are about women triumphing over men. Some stories are 30 pages long, some are half a page long. And I've been writing it on and off for about 15 years. So that's, I'm going through the final proofs at the moment, which is the picture that you saw on Twitter, is the typeset version. So I've got a couple of weeks to check every comma and full stop, and then freak out and want to change it all and panic and realize I can't, and then let it go.
Well,
so that's the next thing, yeah.
It sounds magnificent. I think, you know, it sounds hilarious and magnificent.
There's no laughs. There's no laughs.
Oh dear, not even
No.
dark laughs.
There might be I think on page 128 you might smirk at something briefly, but it's no, there's very few laughs.
Wow, thank goodness for the offing.
Yeah.
We'll just have to keep going with it and reread it and share it. And you know, if anybody hasn't already bought it, I've got lots already to be shipped out to anybody who just wants to experience some of the joy and loveliness that awaits inside the pages. So do order copies if you don't have one, and if you have one, order them for your friends. It's a gift. So
I agree.
So thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat today.
It's a pleasure. It's been fun. Thanks for the good questions from everyone.
Wow. Thank you everybody for coming. And just a quick thing, the next author event, there's a sort of thread of all the books that I've been choosing, and I've been choosing for joyfulness and happiness, and we have Nina Stibbe's going to be speaking to us in June. So have a look on the bookshop website, and then, you know, see if you fancy that. It'd be lovely to see everybody.
She's a lot funnier than me, can I just say? Her books are funny, mine are just like miserable, apart from the offing.
Well, I think we'll go with joy and humour and just go through all the positive emotions. Was the plan with the reading and the event. So but anyway, so thank you so much again, and thank you for everybody to coming. See you again. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.